think that's what piqued my interest in World War II was it was our athletic director who was also a history teacher who was in the 101st Airborne.
Oh my gosh, oh yeah, that gets your attention right away.
Yeah, and he had some great stories too, and I've interviewed him a couple of times, and but he got shot in Market Garden.
Oh my goodness, that's another
He
story
said
unto itself.
the shortest jump he ever made was off the back of a truck. He got shot in the leg.
You know, the Airborne is funny that you said, I don't want to get on too many tangents here, but my mind is racing now because you and I have both been there. But the Airborne are venerated in Normandy by the French. In St. Mary-Église, they still keep a mannequin of a paratrooper on a church steeple. Yeah. You'll see that in that movie. People that are older have seen the movie The Longest Day, where red buttons, as a GI gets caught on the church steeple. This actually happened. It was a little different story than what was in The Longest Day, but they keep the paratrooper up on that church. Even to this day, you can see a GI. The Airborne's venerated, but the Airborne are the troops that were sent in. They got in first. They were dropped early, fought for several weeks, and were pulled out. But then they go off, and they're the first into another action. Then they're the first into into Holland. So they saw a lot of action. Whereas a guy like my dad in the infantry lands on June 8th, but then you're just going. You're just going every day, every day, every day. So you're not pulled out. And Dad said after about a month, he mentioned to one of his buddies, he said, some of these guys look like they're going to crack up. They've had it. They need to get out of here. And my dad's buddy said, don't say that. Don't talk. I don't want to hear that. I get it, but we can't talk like that. And being in Patton's army was a blessing and a curse. Now, Patton didn't take over the 3rd Army until August, so Dad's company and Dad's division got shot up, and had some scurrious leadership for a couple of months. When Patton took over in August, it was just, here we go. We're going to just spearhead. And if we confront a larger force and they're well entrenched, we're going to go around them. We're going to leave them in the rear. So the tactics got better. It was historic. Everything they did was historic. And you know what they did in the Battle of the Bulge? They went into Germany. They were withdrawn, and they went up and helped relieve the 101st and the 82nd Airborne. They didn't save them. The Airborne was never saved. They were designed.
Right.
They were designed to be surrounded.
Right.
Don't ever tell anybody who was in the Airborne. Were you guys surrounded at Bastogne?
Or Patton that saved them.
Patton did not save the Airborne at Bastogne. He just relieved them.
So did you go to Bastogne? Have you been in that battlefield?
I have not been at that battlefield. Nope. I had so much to see in Normandy. And like you said, anyone who goes to Normandy, have a list this long of what you want to see. You're going to see this much of it. You're going to have to go
It's going to take all 2 weeks.
Oh, there's too much to see. Yeah. You mentioned Bloody Gulch. I mean, I'm driving in the car, and I see the statue of Dick Winters from the Band of Brothers. Stop the car. Let me see this real quick. Yeah. I run over there, get back in. Then we go past Bloody Gulch. I said, stop the car. We're doing this, time and time again. There's just too much.
Yeah.
And it's all documented.
Yeah. Well, in Bastogne, outside of Bastogne, they have a museum there, obviously, but they have the
Nuts Museum.
Pardon me?
Is it the Nuts Museum?
Yeah, that's in Bastogne. Then there's another bigger one. I should call it a monument, really.
Gotcha.
But you can go out on top of the monument. You can kind of look at the battlefield. Okay. But then the Bois Jacques is there, and they have the first time I was there, they didn't have they now have a monument to the 82nd and 101st Airborne there, which was not there. Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing that's as a result of Band of Brothers.
Sure. Oh,
but you walk in there, into that Bois Jacques, which basically means a wood, Czech wood.
Mm-hmm.
But you walk in, and they say that because of souvenir diggers, the foxholes still remain, so people are still digging. Mm-hmm. But you can still see there's still some there, that are around.
Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty dense, interesting place to be. Just trying to imagine the trees blowing up above you.
Oh my gosh, tree bursts.
It's crazy. But it's definitely someplace you need to see.
I need to get there. My dad and my mom went back to Normandy in 1969. It was only 25 years afterwards, and Dad found a lot of his foxholes. They were shallow at that time, and he was with a historian who went with him, Henri Levalfre, who was a very famous historian and the chief historian for the 90th Infantry Division. And he was a 12-year-old boy during the battle, but the 90th liberated his hometown, so he became very enthralled with the 90th, and he went with my dad, and they charted the foxholes. So I didn't find any specific holes that Dad had been in. 70 years later, everything is eroded.
Yeah.
But tree clumps were still where they were supposed to be. Towns. I'm sure you saw buildings that still had pock marks in them.
Yep.
I went to a little town called Viviers, which was liberated by my dad's regiment, and we went into the cemetery right beside the main road, and some of the stones that had been there at that time still had bullet holes in them. So you don't find that kind of stuff in the United States. Maybe if you go to Gettysburg.
Yeah.
But this stuff can
Some
be found
places,
everywhere.
yeah.
And then this young college boy whose grandfather had fought in a tank battalion that had fought beside my dad's unit, he kept saying, I wish I could find something, because there's still stuff laying there. If you look hard enough, you can find something. And he kept saying for 2 weeks, I wish I could find something. And we're just walking down a muddy path, and he digs his foot into the mud and says, hey, and he pulls up a clip, an unfired a clip for an M1 rifle. All 8 shots are still in the clip. Pulls it right out of the mud. I said, there you go.
Try to get that back in
Try to
the
get that
airplane.
back to the States, but I wasn't looking for stuff. But
Wow.
when you figure all that went on in World War II and all the ordnance that was fired and all the stuff that was lost, you could go over there right now and find junk. It's going to be junk at this point. All the good stuff is.
Well, even there's a lot of souvenirs. I think about St. Mary Guise, because on the side of that church in that parking lot, there was some guy selling, and this was maybe 5 years ago, selling, knickknacks, souvenirs,
Right.
that he had found in the
Sure.
fields, and they were relatively inexpensive. I'm not that much of a collector, so I wasn't that interested.
I'm
But
not
I found
either.
it interesting that he was sitting next to the church.
Right,
But-
right where the guys had dropped.
Yeah, because there's a cemetery right there too, which was, anyway. So your dad's in Bastogne, and after he leaves Bastogne and Battle of the Bulge, where does he go? He goes back into Germany.
They start heading right into Germany, and this is where the story.
Are they going north or south? They're going
They're
towards
heading.
Czechoslovakia.
They're heading actually east, and then they start cutting through Germany east and south. They wanted to split Germany in half. Their original objective was Frankfurt, and then they said, just cut through that. We're going to, the decision was made to allow the Russians to capture Berlin. Patton wanted Berlin to put on his watch chain with a lot of other things. Patton is such an interesting figure because of what he wanted to capture. You saw this early on when he landed in Sicily, and he goes to Messina. Then he goes and captures the capital before Montgomery got there, just to say, I'm a little bit more aggressive commander than Montgomery. Montgomery was a great commander, just more cautious. But yeah, Dad's unit, the 90th Division, 3rd Army, ends up cutting Germany in half and moving towards the south. And as they do, they go through the town of Merkers, Germany, and discover the salt mine that has the entire gold reserve of the Third Reich in there. If you see the movie Monuments Men, they show pictures that were taken inside the Merkers mine. My dad actually got assigned for almost a week to go down in this salt mine, 1,200 feet, and put art treasures onto jeeps to be extricated. So not only does Dad land at Normandy right after D-Day, not only does he race across France with Patton, not only does he participate in the Battle of the Bulge, now he's in Germany and he's at the famous salt mine. When you're with Patton, you're going to make history.
Right.
And now the paintings that he handled were crated up, but they were all marked with who the master was and what the work was, so he knows what he handled, and put them on jeeps. So they're just throwing these paintings. They need to get them out of this mine, and there were many strips of tunnels in this mine. Some had art treasures, some had statues. The famous Egyptian statue of Queen Nefertiti was in this mine. Dad didn't see it, but this is considered one of the greatest art treasures ever found. It was found in ancient Egypt by the German archaeologists, but it's many hundreds of years before Christ, BC. And then once they get done with that, he comes out of this mine, and the next stop is Flossenburg concentration camp. So he's in on the liberation of a concentration camp. Now, this is one of the smaller camps, but 30,000 people died there in 5 years. I don't think Dad went into that camp. He actually took a snapshot outside the gates. I think what was done there in the liberation was done before he actually was in that camp. And he goes from there into Czechoslovakia, and now they hear the Russians are the next village over, so that's where his war ends. So he got to see everything that happened in the upper European campaign. while at the same time, the other armies are fighting up from the south of the southern part of France and towards the east. Italy was never fully captured. We never fully knocked off the Germans in Italy, which I find is very interesting. Mm-hmm. But the war ends. He turned 20 years old during the Battle of Bulge. Here's a kid from Ohio that hadn't done much outside of Ohio, and like millions of others, then he finds himself in France. The world is just spinning about you. And once you're done with it all, you look back as to where you were. And he said some of the guys that were lost in Normandy, he didn't even know what had happened to these guys. He just knew they weren't part of the unit anymore. Then you start gathering your thoughts once the war's over. Then you find out what happened to Sergeant Liebeck. Oh, Liebeck was killed here. Sergeant Smith was killed here. You're gathering your thoughts. And then he actually wrote a memoir in the 1960s, which I have, which gives me a lot of information, a lot of details, and I'm glad he did that. And he even put in the memoir, he said, a lot of guys said, I'm going to write a book about this damn war and let people know what really happened, and then you get done with it and you're like, I don't even want to think about the war again. So Dad wrote a memoir. So I've got dates, I've got names, I've got locations, and I've used that as a guide. I've actually published, it's just a private publishing, but I've got 258 pages of what he did and the names of people.
So let me ask you about that. So
Okay.
The first question I have is, so your dad's documenting this process while he's in the war. He has a camera with him.
Nope, he AJ, this is funny because, number one, this is dispelling, and I don't claim to be a military expert. I'm not. When I get around some other people who know a lot about the military, I find out I don't know that much. You didn't want to carry much, because you're on your feet all the time. So you think you're picking up souvenirs, you're carrying a Luger, you're finding this. No, you're not doing that. You want to travel light. The first thing they did was throw their gas masks away. They get into Normandy and they're throwing off stuff. They don't want to carry it. Dad did bring a souvenir pistol home, but he also used it in combat. But I lost your original point here.
I was asking about, did he have a camera? Because you said that he had taken a picture of the concentration camp.
I think somebody actually took it for him. He couldn't afford a camera, for one thing. And in combat, they say no journals, no diaries, no cameras, because if you're captured, now the enemy has a lot of information. So,
right.
All the notes he made were mental notes. And if someone who was attached to the division took a picture and he was able to get a copy of that picture.
So, yeah, that was my next question. So there's a division historian somewhere, probably in the military or
right. There are people taking movies even. You can get movie clips of where they were.
Oh, like newsreels.
Newsreels, but oftentimes
Ed Hurley.
Ed Hurley, yeah. A lot of these, they're called combat reels. If you go on YouTube and look up combat reels, you can find the 90th Infantry Division. You can find a lot of divisions and see what they were doing. A lot of times it's after the fact because, they didn't want these camera guys up front. They're going to get killed for one thing. So a lot of it is the liberation of man, the liberation of Le Mans, those kind of things. But those are documented. But yeah, they traveled light. They didn't want to carry stuff. First of all, you start off in the Normandy campaign, they're wearing the wrong uniforms. The uniforms are too heavy. Their guys are having heat prostration all the time. And then you're finally in the right uniform for about 2 months in the fall. Then you get in the winter and you don't have enough clothing. And that's why Dad's memoir is so interesting, because it talks about, you're never in the right place. You never have enough food. You never have the right equipment. The U.S. Army does as well as it can. And Patton's racing ahead, so you don't have enough fuel sometimes, or they're cutting you off because you're getting ahead of the other Allied armies. And Dad wrote a number of times in the Battle of the Bulge how they felt so visible because they didn't have white clothing. They might grab a bed sheet somewhere and wrap in a bed sheet, but he said we were outlined perfectly in the snow, whereas the German defenders a lot of times were in white uniforms, had their helmets painted white. So, the U.S. armies were victorious because of supply, because they had a great cause, they had that great leadership. But as the Germans are fighting this defensive action, finally, in Normandy, they're pretty much on the defense.
Yep.
They're just fighting a great defensive action. And then they become offensive again in the Bulge. They attack us, but then we push back, but we're just losing men right and left because of the defensive struggle of the Germans were masterful at falling back and then counterattacking and then dropping back. So it's really
in the memoir, your dad's talking about this, but I think I read on your Facebook page that you were creating art photo pictures to go along with this? Explain what that's about. I didn't really understand what.
Dad drew some pictures.
So it was your dad
After
that
the
drew?
war, he drew those. He had some ink sketches and this makes up for not having a camera. You're going by memory, which to me is even better because it's got your personal touch in it.
Yep.
He has one figure that says, "This is the enemy." It's an outline of a German soldier walking and holding a rifle, but the whole thing is just black. It's dark. It looks like it looks like Darth Vader. I'm like, this is an enemy. This is an enemy soldier. Drew a picture of this large railroad gun that was firing upon them when they were bogged down. And one of the few times they got bogged down with Patton was at Metz, France. Maybe you've been at Metz. One of the few times they were stopped, and this railroad gun was firing on them. And he drew a picture of that, and a couple self-portraits and other things that were drawn from pictures. So I do have a pictorial record of certain things, but mostly drawings or pictures that were given to him.
So is this something you're selling? Is this a
No,
published?
I keep this I have.
But you said you published it.
I've published it, but this is a personal publishing.
Okay.
I print like 2 or 3 at a time, and if I find someone whose uncle or grandfather served with my dad, I might send them a copy. I don't see myself ever selling it. For one thing, my favorite historian, Victor Davis Hanson, you probably have heard of Victor Davis Hanson, famous historian. I think he said there have been like 7,000 accounts of World War II that have been done, probably personal memoirs. And I thought, this is all the world needs is another World War II story. Now, I think it's unique. What makes it unique is the fact that Dad was one of very, very few originals of his company to make this entire trip. But at the same time, over 12 million American men were in uniform in World War II. And each one, my wife always gets on me, she goes, "What do you find interesting about this?" I said, because every one of these stories is unique. Every person had a little bit, it's like a fingerprint.
Yeah.
Every story is a little bit unique.
So let's kind of finish this up with your dad's in Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
What happens after that? The VE Day, then they get shipped home. Where does he go? Does he go back to England? Does he get shipped from France?
I wish I knew more about this part, but there was a point system. So obviously the guys that accumulated the most points are out of there. As a matter of fact, my uncle, my dad's oldest brother, was in the Pacific, made 4 island landings with the 40th Division and accumulated enough points before the war was over to be sent home before we were done in the Pacific. My dad with 11 months of combat and was in 5 separate campaigns, but still didn't have enough points to be released right away. And I don't know how those points were accrued. I don't know if you got extras for being wounded, perhaps you did, or whatever. But he ends the war in a little town called Strebrin Hory, Czechoslovakia. Don't ask me to spell that. But he's put on occupation duty and has moved back to Germany and is mainly in the area of, I believe, in the Frankfurt area. I'd have to double check that. So it's an inauspicious duty where you're trying to stay awake now, You've got all these armed young Americans. There's plenty of, they show this in the Band of Brothers, the movie, how there are plenty of firearms, there's plenty of alcohol, and nothing for these guys to do. But he had a pretty calm occupation. And in January of 1946, finally he gets to come home. So his parents hadn't seen him, from when he left in 1940, and later in 1943 he had been able to come back for a visit. So I always say he left a very young 18-year-old and came back a very old 20-year-old. Whereas his older brother, my Uncle Russ, was gone for 3 years. So he actually was 22 when he left and came back when he was 26. He was just about 23 and had just turned 26 when he came back. So this was not uncommon for families to not see relatives that had left. And did they write home? Yes, but a lot of these letters were redacted. You write a letter and so much is redacted by the officer that by the time it reaches home, they don't know where you're at.
It's Morse code.
I've heard a lot of service people tell me that the people at home were telling the service people where they were at. I read that the 90th in Metz, France. I read that you guys just came through Le Mans. I read that you're now in the Saar region of Germany. So now they're reading where they're at. It's it's a little bit delayed. But everything had to be redacted in case it was confiscated by the enemy, which happened now and then.
Where did your dad, I'm assuming, took the GI Bill and then ended up in college somewhere?
Ended up at a little school called Findlay College.
Oh, no kidding.
Which was like 2 blocks from his house. So at the end of World War II, there were all sorts of GIs at Findlay College. As a matter of fact, you said you want to wrap this, we could talk all day, but when my dad was at Findlay College playing baseball here, there were 5 guys that all went to professional baseball from Findlay College. But, my dad was already 21. One guy was 23. These guys were all a little bit older. You're a 21-year-old guy who's been overseas, 22, is a lot different individual than someone who, like I was at 21, who went to high school, went to college. These guys have seen the world. I went on the GI Bill, became a teacher, and wouldn't have done that, I don't think, without the GI Bill. Wouldn't have been able to afford it. Probably didn't have those aspirations. But now that your life's been on the line, you're like, let me make something out of myself. And his older brother became a teacher on the GI Bill.